Welcome! In this movie, we would like to present to you some important background information on left and right hemispheric specialization and lateralization of the human brain. An important consideration in studying hemispheric specialization and lateralization are the insights gained in studying the effects of cerebral commissurotomy, otherwise known as the split brain surgery. After providing the basics on cerebral organization, our focus will turn to the split brain procedure and its impact on what we know about lateralization. The question of how the human brain coordinates the infinite array of cognitive functions, abilities, and tasks that we are uniquely capable of provides a direct link to the fervent study of hemispheric specialization and lateralization. The occlusion of functional location and mechanism within the enigmatic cortex leaves researchers avidly staring down their microscopes, piecing together the clues to what enables the human condition. Where does perception occur and what filters it? Every day we are bombarded with visual stimuli which demands categorization and definitive meaning. What mechanisms enable such enormous complexity? How do we recognize faces and define such as the self? The importance of self-recognition and the maintenance of interpersonal relationships by association are vital to humans as we are social creatures. What areas of the cortex monitor language? An imperative and unique aspect of our ability as humans, language represents an intense area of study within the limelight of hemispheric lateralization. Each of these questions is an example of a fundamental question which can be at least partially considered through the lens of hemispheric specialization. Following the perspective of natural selection and explanation, the prominent theory would hold that the left and right hemispheres of the cerebral cortex do not perform identical functions but maintain unitary control over designated specifications. However, it is important to remember that hemispheric specialization does not indicate the existence of two separate minds producing two separate experiences of consciousness with segregated strengths. The root of this idea, an extreme dominance of one hemisphere over the other, permeates today's pop culture scene, even making an appearance in the latest Mercedes-Benz advertisement. Unfortunately, such pop culture cues often lead to a gross oversimplification and misunderstanding of the true lateralization of the human brain and its ensuing control over cognitive function. The anatomy of the human brain indicates that unilateral specialization does not dominate structurally, but rather is sublimated by duplication within the cortices. In other words, the left and right hemispheres are more similar than they are overtly different, as various cognitive functions can be traced to both sides of the human brain. However, while the left and right hemispheres certainly maintain a similar framework of function, including motor cortices, they are not identical. Significant differences in hemispheric lateralization generally lie on the plane of subtlety. For instance, an often cited example of hemispheric specialization is the prominent location of speech in the dominant left hemisphere for 96% of humans. This localization of speech is adaptive and it provides for a more rapid communication than a transcortical process, representing a prominent functional asymmetry within the human brain. A key concept to understanding the organization of the cerebral cortex remains that overall there is a solid foundational symmetry which is embellished and enhanced by an adaptive functional asymmetry. With the affirmation of language asymmetry igniting a ferocious fire, a cascade of research set out to determine other structural and functional asymmetries. One such finding is that the Sylvian fissure curls farther upward in the right hemisphere than in the left hemisphere. Also, the planum temporale is larger in the left hemisphere. Such an asymmetry directly correlates to the dominance of language in the left hemisphere, which presumably requires more surface area. Currently, a significant emphasis is focused upon functional asymmetry at the cellular level, specifically the firing of neuronal columns. For example, unique synaptic connections of a cortical area may determine its designated function. The possibility of asymmetry based on an individual neuronal level is being researched as tangential dendritic spines on neurons lend a unique quality to the cells of the auditory cortex. Together, these examples represent important scientific steps toward further understanding of the degree of specialization and its contribution to cortical organization within the human brain. Imperative to concerted function, communication between the cerebral hemispheres is largely facilitated by the corpus callosum. Translating literally to hard body, the corpus callosum is the largest fiber system in the brain. A bundle of white matter, the corpus callosum contains more than 200 million axons. Passing through the corpus callosum, these fibers connect homotopic regions, including the prefrontal cortices, and heterotopic areas, enabling efficient interhemispheric communication and the diversification of input. With the advent of new imaging techniques, such as diffusion tensor imaging, the role of various sections of the corpus callosum in communication are being investigated further. For example, the splenium, located at the posterior end of the corpus callosum, has been shown to maintain both homotopic and heterotopic connections with the posterior visual areas in the occipital cortex and the posterior parietal cortex. Also, the anterior portion of the corpus callosum, including the genu, is implicated in the transfer of higher-order semantic information. If the corpus callosum is the cornerstone to integrative functioning, then what happens when the callosal fibers are severed, leaving the cerebral hemispheres unable to communicate and collaborate? Pioneered by Ronald Myers and Roger Sperry and then pursued by Michael Gazzaniga in the 1960s, the cerebral commissurotomy procedure proved to be an effective treatment for individuals with intractable epilepsy. Unlike previous surgeries, the split brain operation does not destroy tissue, but merely cuts the lines of communication between the hemispheres by severing the corpus callosum, allowing researchers to evaluate the independent functioning of each hemisphere. Following the advent of this surgery, much was determined in regards to human lateralization from patients who had undergone the split brain procedure. With the complete severance of the corpus callosum, visual and tactile information can no longer cross hemispheres. This was demonstrated by placing an object in the right hand of a patient who was then able to name it. But if the object was placed in the left hand, the patient could not name it. This confirmed the notion that language resides primarily in the dominant left hemisphere. But be sure to remember the role of the splenium. If it's left intact, the transfer of visual information across hemispheres remains normal. Because split brain patients cannot integrate visual stimuli, conceptual ambiguous words pairs presented to both visual fields are almost always drawn literally. For example, the words toad and stool would provoke a patient to draw a toad literally sitting on a stool rather than the typical mushroom. Split brain patients are also able to simultaneously draw two separate visual stimuli presented to their separated hemispheres. The average person cannot do this because the hemispheres seek to integrate and compete for visual attention. Research on split brain patients has also led to lateralization insights regarding causal perception and reasoning, which are imperative to inferring possible event-related relationships. Causal perception is a detection of the influence that one object has on another in time and space. Split brain studies have revealed that such judgments are best made when the information is presented to the left visual field to be processed by the right hemisphere. On the other hand, causal inference depends on the left hemisphere's need to utilize logic and concepts to interpret complexities and arrive at a perceived unitary whole. From these studies, it has been determined that the right hemisphere is more simplistic in its approach to problem solving, while the left hemisphere follows its need to find order in forming hypotheses about sequence, searching for a pattern. In other words, the left hemisphere, as an innate interpreter, looks for explanations for both internal and external events to assemble a comprehensive whole. Together, the left and right hemispheric approaches are functional complements. Considerable research is now being pursued in the lateralization of facial recognition and expression production in normal individuals. In reference to perception, the right hemisphere maintains an efficient ability to detect upright faces, both familiar and unfamiliar. The left hemisphere also recognizes faces, but is not necessarily as adept at the right hemisphere, especially in reference to unfamiliar faces. Split brain individuals are able to identify their own faces with both hemispheres. In regards to familiar faces, both hemispheres maintain a degree of dysfunction, but the left is slightly more adept. And now, with the background information presented and the function of hemispheric lateralization and face recognition in the foreground, we would like to turn your attention to NG, a split brain case study.